It was a quiet Saturday morning in a suburban neighborhood where the streets were lined with trees and houses that all looked similar at first glance. People were starting their weekend routines, mowing lawns, taking out the trash, or simply enjoying a cup of coffee on their porches. In one particular house, a man who had lived there for years was just finishing a small project in his garage. The garage was his personal space, a place where he could tinker, work on hobbies, and store things that didn't quite belong inside the house. He had always kept it organized, but also filled it with things that might seem unusual to someone who didn't know him well. He was halfway through a new project, carefully arranging tools and materials when he noticed movement from the corner of his eye. Across the street, one of the neighbors, a woman who had a reputation for being overly cautious about rules, was staring in his direction. She seemed tense, her eyebrows furrowed, and her lips pressed tightly together. He waved casually, but she didn't wave back. Instead, she reached for her phone and started dialing. We didn't think much of it at first, assuming she was probably calling a family member or making a quick note to herself. But as time passed, he realized her focus was entirely on him and the garage. The man continued his work, trying not to let it bother him. He had always known that some neighbors were more concerned about appearances than reality, but this felt different. A few minutes later, he heard the faint sound of a siren in the distance. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly glanced around. Sure enough, a police car was turning onto his street. His stomach sank as he realized the woman must have called the authorities, convinced that something suspicious was happening in his garage. By the time the police car pulled up in front of his house, a small crowd had started to gather. Neighbors peeked over fences, some curious, others whispering to one another. He felt a mix of frustration and embarrassment. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but explaining that to a group of people who had already jumped to conclusions was going to be a challenge. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked to the front yard as the officers stepped out of their vehicle. The officers were polite, but formal. They asked him what he was doing in the garage, and if he had permission to carry out the work he was doing. He explained calmly, detailing the project and showing them the organized setup of his garage. He mentioned that he spent a lot of time there working on personal projects, and that everything in the garage was completely legal and safe. He could see the officers listening intently, taking notes and nodding, but he also noticed the skeptical looks from some of the neighbors who had gathered to watch. Meanwhile, the woman who had called the police stood off to the side, arms crossed, clearly expecting to find some wrongdoing. She whispered to another neighbor, pointing toward the garage, making sure everyone knew that she had been the one to alert the authorities. Her expression was one of triumph mixed with concern, as if she wanted to be right but also didn't want to appear confrontational. But the man could feel the tension building, and he knew that the situation could become more stressful if he didn't handle it carefully. He took a deep breath and decided to invite the officers and anyone curious into the garage. He wanted to show them firsthand that there was nothing to worry about. Slowly, he opened the garage door, revealing a space that was carefully organized, but full of surprises for anyone who didn't know him well. There were tools neatly arranged on pegboards, workbenches with small projects in progress, and shelves filled with various materials. It looked like a normal workshop to him, but he could already see the puzzled looks on some faces as people tried to make sense of it. The woman who had called the police stepped forward, peering into the garage with narrowed eyes. She muttered under her breath, clearly struggling to reconcile what she expected with the reality in front of her. Some neighbors chuckled quietly. Others looked impressed, and a few simply shook their heads. The man walked them through his projects, explaining each one briefly and showing that everything was harmless. He could see the skepticism fading from the officers' faces as they nodded and took note of the explanations. Despite the initial tension, there was a sense of relief beginning to spread. The man realized that showing the truth openly was the best way to calm the situation. He continued explaining his projects, including a small woodworking project he had been working on for months, a model building he was crafting meticulously, and a collection of antique items he enjoyed restoring. Each item had a story, and he shared them briefly, hoping that the personal touch would help the neighbors understand that nothing was dangerous or illegal. Karen, the neighbor who had called the police, finally spoke up. Her voice was a mix of defensiveness and curiosity. She asked questions about specific items in the garage, trying to understand what they were and why he had them. The man answered patiently, knowing that her initial judgment had been based on ignorance rather than malice. He explained that his hobbies were his way of relaxing and expressing creativity, and that the garage was simply a space where he could do that without disturbing anyone. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere started to shift. Neighbors who had been whispering and judging began to see the situation differently. Some apologized quietly for assuming the worst, while others laughed at their own overreactions. The officers thanked him for being cooperative and informative, and they left, satisfied that there was no threat or violation of any law. The man waved them off, relieved that the misunderstanding had been resolved. After the police left, the man returned to his work in the garage, feeling a mixture of relief and amusement. He knew that Karen's quick judgment and the subsequent call to the police had caused unnecessary stress, but he also recognized that it had given him a chance to show the truth openly. He continued his projects now with a few curious neighbors, peeking in occasionally, asking questions, and even expressing interest in learning about some of the things he was making. Karen, meanwhile, lingered at the edge of the yard, clearly processing what she had just witnessed. Her face showed a combination of embarrassment and reluctant admiration. The man didn't confront her directly, but continued to work calmly, letting the truth speak for itself. He understood that people sometimes acted out of fear or misunderstanding, and he chose patience and openness over confrontation. By the end of the morning, the neighborhood had returned to its usual calm. The man had completed part of his project. The garage had been revealed for what it truly was, and the lesson about assumptions had quietly been made. The experience left him with a sense of satisfaction, not just because he had defended himself successfully, but because he had done so in a way that was honest, respectful, and human. He knew that life in a neighborhood could sometimes be complicated, but he also knew that patience, transparency, and a little bit of courage could turn a tense situation into an opportunity for understanding and connection. After the police had left, the man thought the situation might finally settle down. He returned to his garage, intending to continue his projects in peace. However, the tension in the air lingered. Neighbors who had witnessed the police visit still stood around in small clusters, talking quietly among themselves. Their whispers carried over the yard, some expressing curiosity, others amusement, and a few clearly embarrassed by the misunderstanding. Karen, the neighbor who had called the authorities, stood apart, arms crossed and staring at the garage with a mix of suspicion and disbelief. The man wiped his hands on a rag and shook his head slightly. He had hoped that showing the garage's contents would be enough to satisfy anyone watching. Yet he realized that sometimes people needed more than a quick look. They needed to see, to touch, or even to experience for themselves. Deciding to stay calm and patient, he continued arranging his workspace while keeping an eye on the gathering crowd. He wanted to avoid confrontation, but also wanted to make sure the truth about his garage was understood as he organized his tools. He noticed Karen approaching him cautiously. Her footsteps were measured, as though she were unsure whether to ask a question or retreat. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm, but not hostile. She asked about a strange-looking object on the workbench, a collection of wires and small mechanical parts. The man smiled gently, understanding her curiosity. He explained that it was part of a project he had been working on for several weeks, a small automated device that required patience and precision. He invited her to take a closer look, hoping that hands-on exposure would clear any lingering doubts. Karen hesitated for a moment, then leaned in to inspect the device. As she observed the careful arrangement of parts and the neat labeling he had applied, her expression softened. She asked more questions, trying to understand how it worked and what its purpose was. The man answered each one patiently, describing the mechanics and his reasoning for each step. Slowly, her defensive posture began to fade, replaced by a tentative curiosity. Meanwhile, other neighbors gathered closer, some still whispering but now more openly expressing interest. One neighbor asked if Thea could see a woodworking project that had caught his eye earlier. The man nodded and walked them over to a bench where several small wooden models were displayed. Each piece had been handcrafted, sanded, and painted with care. The neighbors examined them, asking about techniques and materials, and the man explained enthusiastically. The initial tension in the air began to dissipate, replaced by genuine engagement and admiration. Karen stayed nearby, listening and observing. She seemed conflicted, caught between lingering suspicion and a growing recognition that she had overreacted. The man noticed her hesitation, but did not call attention to it. Instead, he continued to share details about his hobbies and projects, making the explanations accessible and engaging. He talked about the satisfaction of creating something with his own hands, the importance of focus and patience, and the joy of finishing a project that had taken weeks or months to complete. His passion was evident. It began to have a subtle effect on those around him. As the morning turned to early afternoon, a few children from the neighborhood approached cautiously. They were curious about the mechanical device and the wooden models. The man encouraged them to look closely and even allowed them to touch and explore under his supervision. Their laughter and questions added a light-hearted energy to the scene, drawing smiles from the adults who were watching. Karen looked on, clearly trying to reconcile her earlier assumptions with the playful and harmless reality unfolding before her. During a brief pause, one of the neighbors commented on how easy it was to jump to conclusions. They admitted that they had initially been suspicious too, but seeing the garage and hearing the explanations had completely changed their perspective. The man nodded, appreciating the honesty and the shift in the atmosphere. He realized that the event, while stressful, had become an unexpected opportunity to connect with the community and show a different side of himself that most people never saw. Karen finally spoke again, this time with a quieter tone. She admitted that she had acted hastily and apologized for calling the police without understanding the situation fully. The man accepted her apology graciously, emphasizing that he understood her concern came from a place of caution. He explained that sometimes things could look alarming from a distance, but were perfectly innocent in reality. Her expression showed relief and a hint of humility, signaling that she had learned a subtle but important lesson about assumptions. The neighbors continued to explore the garage, asking questions and listening to explanations. The man demonstrated a few small techniques, showing how he had built certain items and how the mechanical device functioned. People were engaged and genuinely impressed. Even Karen seemed intrigued, asking detailed questions and showing interest in the process rather than focusing on suspicion. The energy had shifted from confrontation to education and curiosity, and the man felt a sense of accomplishment in turning a tense situation into something positive throughout the afternoon. The man noticed that some neighbors who had previously avoided interaction were now participating in the conversation. They asked for advice on starting small projects of their own or tips for organizing workspaces. The garage had become a focal point of curiosity and learning, rather than a source of conflict. Karen lingered for a while, observing and listening, before retreating back to her own yard. She seemed thoughtful, perhaps reflecting on how quickly she had judged the situation without seeking understanding first. As the sun began to lower in the sky, the crowd slowly dispersed. The man returned to his workbench, feeling a mix of relief and quiet satisfaction. The day had started with tension and misunderstanding, but had transformed into an opportunity for connection, education, and even a little fun. The neighbors had seen the truth, learned something new, and in some ways the man felt closer to them than he had before. Even Karen, though still reserved, had been part of the experience, witnessing firsthand that assumptions could be misleading. By the evening, the street had returned to its usual calm. The man had completed a portion of his projects, shared knowledge, and demonstrated patience under pressure. He reflected on the events, recognizing that while people could sometimes act hastily, there was an opportunity to respond with understanding, transparency, and calmness. He realized that tension and misunderstandings were part of life, but they could be transformed into positive experiences with patience and a willingness to share the truth openly. The man cleaned up his workspace, putting tools back in their designated places and making sure everything was tidy. He felt a sense of peace, knowing that the day's events had passed without further conflict. Karen and a few other neighbors waved as they returned to their homes, and the man waved back, acknowledging the end of the day's unusual but meaningful interactions. The garage, once the center of suspicion, had become a symbol of harmless creativity and a reminder that appearances could be deceiving. But patience and openness could reveal the truth. The next morning, the man felt a mixture of curiosity and cautious anticipation. Even though the previous day had ended peacefully, he knew that the story of his garage had already spread through the neighborhood. People were talking quietly over fences, at mailboxes, and on social media, speculating about what they had seen and heard. The man had spent years enjoying his private projects in solitude, but now it seemed his little world had drawn more attention than ever. He decided to embrace the situation, allowing anyone who wanted to see the truth to witness it in an orderly and respectful way. As he opened the garage door, a small group of neighbors had already gathered, drawn by curiosity. Some were hesitant, unsure if they should approach, while others leaned over the fence, eager to catch a glimpse. Karen stood slightly apart, watching with her usual intensity, but there was a flicker of cautious interest in her eyes. The man smiled politely at everyone, inviting them to step closer and see what he had been working on. Inside the garage, the man had prepared a few new displays to help neighbors understand the scope of his projects. There were shelves dedicated to small mechanical inventions, each carefully labeled and partially disassembled to show the inner workings. Wooden models of buildings and vehicles were arranged on a long table, showing the level of craftsmanship he had poured into them. There was also a small corner for electronics and coding projects, with wires, microcontrollers, and tiny screens blinking quietly. To anyone unfamiliar with these hobbies, the garage might have seemed chaotic at first glance, but every item had a purpose and a place. The man began to explain, moving slowly from one area to another. He described the mechanical devices first, talking about the problem each one was designed to solve, how it worked, and what he hoped to accomplish. He encouraged neighbors to ask questions, and one by one they did. A few tried to touch the items, and he guided them carefully, showing how to handle delicate parts without damaging anything. As people interacted with the projects, their expressions shifted from confusion to fascination. Even Karen, though still slightly defensive, leaned in to observe closely, asking about circuits and motors, her tone now curious rather than accusatory. Next, he turned to the woodworking projects. He showed a detailed model of a vintage train, explaining how each piece had been cut, sanded, and painted by hand. He demonstrated a small tool technique, letting a neighbor try it for themselves. The excitement in their eyes was palpable, and the air buzzed with admiration and engagement. Karen watched quietly, occasionally nodding, perhaps realizing that her earlier assumptions had been completely wrong. Some of the neighbors laughed, realizing that the things they had worried about the day before were nothing to be concerned about. Children asked questions about how things were made, and the man responded with patience and enthusiasm. Glad to share his knowledge with a younger audience, the final part of the garage was perhaps the most surprising. He had set up a small interactive station for electronics and coding, something most neighbors had never encountered. Tiny robots moved along tracks, sensors reacted to light and touch, little screens displayed patterns that changed with movement. He explained each part of the system, showing how programming, electronics, mechanics came together to create something that could respond intelligently to its environment. The neighbors were visibly impressed, many leaning forward to get a better look. Karen, now fully engaged, asked detailed questions about the sensors and coding, clearly eager to understand how it all worked. As the demonstration continued, a sense of awe spread through the group. People who had come with suspicion were now amazed at the skill, patience, and creativity required to build such things. Conversations shifted from judgment to curiosity and admiration. A neighbor whispered to another about how wrong assumptions could be. Others nodded, realizing that seeing the reality firsthand had completely changed their perspective. Karen, standing near the back, crossed her arms but smiled faintly, acknowledging that she had misjudged the situation. Her posture had softened, and she seemed more willing to engage respectfully. The man encouraged neighbors to participate in small activities. Children could operate simple circuits under supervision, Adults could try assembling a small wooden piece, and anyone curious could interact with the robotic setup. Hands-on involvement created excitement and made the experience personal. People laughed when small mistakes caused unexpected movements in the robot's or when a wooden piece didn't fit perfectly. The man guided them patiently, helping them learn and enjoy the process. Karen, surprisingly, volunteered to help a child with a small assembly, showing that her curiosity had overcome her previous judgment. Throughout the day, more neighbors stopped by, drawn by the noise and excitement. Each new visitor was welcomed, and the man explained his projects with the same enthusiasm as before. Conversations about tools, techniques, and personal hobbies replaced speculation about danger or impropriety. By mid-afternoon, the garage had transformed from a source of tension into a place of learning and enjoyment. The man reflected on how quickly perceptions could change once people were given the opportunity to understand the truth. At one point, a neighbor asked about the time and effort required for each project. The man explained that patience, attention to detail, and persistence were key. Sharing stories of projects that had taken weeks or months to complete, he talked about the satisfaction of solving problems, overcoming challenges, and seeing a project come together after careful planning and work. The audience listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others asking questions about techniques and materials. Karen, now fully attentive, even offered a suggestion about organizing tools more efficiently, showing that she had shifted from critic to collaborator in some small way. As the sun began to set, the man realized how different the day had been from the morning when tensions had been high. He looked around the garage and saw neighbors chatting happily, children laughing, and Karen observing quietly. The environment had shifted from suspicion and judgment to engagement, learning, and appreciation. It was a remarkable transformation, one that the man hadn't expected when the day began. He felt a sense of pride and relief, knowing that patience, transparency, and a willingness to share had turned a potentially negative situation into something positive. Before the visitors left, the man encouraged anyone who was curious to return another day. He offered to demonstrate more complex projects, teach simple techniques, and help anyone who wanted to try a new hobby. Many neighbors thanked him, expressing genuine appreciation for his openness and willingness to share. Karen, lingering slightly behind the group, nodded and gave a small smile, signaling that she had learned an important lesson about assumptions and patience. Once the last visitor had left, the man closed the garage door slowly, reflecting on the day. He realized that while some people might act hastily or judge without knowing all the facts, there was an opportunity to turn misunderstandings into positive experiences. His garage, once a source of suspicion, had become a space of learning, creativity, and community engagement. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that sharing his passions had not only showcased his skills, but it also built bridges with neighbors in ways he hadn't anticipated. That evening, the street returned to its usual calm. Lights glowed softly from houses, and the sounds of evening routines filled the air. The man sat quietly in his garage, tidying up his tools and putting projects away for the night. He felt satisfaction, knowing that the day's events had turned a potentially tense situation into an opportunity for understanding, connection, and growth. Karen's earlier accusations seemed distant now, replaced by a newfound respect for his work and dedication. The garage had revealed the truth, not just about the projects inside, but about patience, openness, and the value of seeing beyond assumptions. It had become a symbol of creativity, learning, and community, and the man felt proud to be at the center of it all. The following day, the neighborhood was buzzing quietly with stories about the previous events. People who had been hesitant to speak the day before were now curious and eager to learn more. The man had become the center of attention, though he preferred to remain calm and focused on his projects. He decided that, instead of hiding or avoiding the curiosity, he would use it as an opportunity to connect with the community in a positive way. He prepared his garage for visitors, making sure each project was neat and presentable, with simple explanations ready for anyone who asked. By mid-morning, a small crowd had gathered outside the garage, some neighbors leaning over fences, others standing respectfully at a distance. Children peered with wide eyes, asking questions in soft voices. Karen stood nearby, a little apart from the group, her posture showing a mixture of caution and curiosity. She had spent the night reflecting on her actions and the misunderstandings that had occurred. Her initial defensiveness had softened, and there was a hint of admiration in her eyes for the man's skill and patience. The man greeted everyone warmly and invited them inside the garage. As he opened the door, a sense of excitement rippled through the crowd. Today, he decided, he would go further, showing the details and processes behind each project rather than just the finished results. He started with the mechanical devices, explaining not just what each item did, but how he had designed and built it from scratch. He demonstrated basic principles and encouraged people to try simple experiments under his guidance. The neighbors leaned in, listening intently, asking questions, and occasionally laughing at small mistakes that he allowed them to make, turning learning into a fun experience. Karen watched closely, her arms uncrossed, clearly absorbing every detail. She asked about the design process, the materials used, and the thought behind each step. The man answered carefully, offering explanations that were simple but detailed enough to satisfy curiosity. He spoke about planning, problem-solving, and patience, illustrating how even small projects required thought and care. Karen nodded, visibly impressed, and even asked if she could try one of the simpler tasks under his supervision. The man agreed, guiding her gently and giving her encouragement. This moment marked a significant shift in her attitude, from suspicion to respect and engagement. The man then moved on to the woodworking section, showing how he cut, sanded, and assembled each model. He demonstrated techniques for creating smooth surfaces, precise joints, and detailed paintwork. Neighbors followed along, eager to try a piece themselves. Children were allowed to use safe tools with guidance, creating small models under his supervision. Their laughter and excitement filled the garage, lightening the atmosphere and turning what had been tension into joy. Karen assisted one of the children, helping them hold a small piece steady while they sanded it. Her careful attention and willingness to help reflected her new perspective. Next, the man led the group to the electronics and coding section. The blinking screens, sensors, and small robots captured everyone's attention. He explained basic coding principles, showing how instructions controlled the robot's movements and responses. Neighbors asked questions about programming, circuits, and the science behind the devices. He encouraged hands-on interaction, allowing people to adjust sensors and see the immediate effects. Karen, now fully engaged, experimented with adjusting a sensor, delighted when the robot responded exactly as expected. Her curiosity had replaced her earlier judgment, and she seemed genuinely interested in understanding the complexity behind the projects. Throughout the day, the man emphasized patience and observation. He explained that mistakes were part of learning, and that careful attention to detail was more important than speed. He demonstrated techniques slowly, ensuring everyone could follow along. The neighbors listened attentively, some nodding as they connected the ideas to their own experiences, and children asked for help repeatedly, and the man guided them patiently. It's creating an environment where learning was encouraged and mistakes were celebrated as part of the process. At one point, a neighbor expressed surprise at how much effort went into each project. The man explained that even small details mattered, and that taking the time to plan, measure, and execute properly was essential. He shared stories of challenges he had faced, explaining how each mistake had taught him something new. The neighbors were visibly impressed, realizing that what might look like a simple hobby from the outside required dedication, skill, and creativity. Karen listened closely, nodding in agreement, her earlier assumptions fading further. As the day continued, more neighbors arrived, drawn by the activity and excitement. The man welcomed each new visitor, giving brief demonstrations and letting them try small tasks themselves. Laughter, curiosity, and learning filled the garage. The street, which had seemed tense and quiet just a few days before, was now lively and engaged. Karen stayed involved, asking insightful questions and assisting children and neighbors alike. She had moved from critic to participant, and the transformation was evident to everyone present. Around mid-afternoon, The man gathered everyone for a brief explanation of how different projects connected. He showed how woodworking, mechanics, and electronics could work together, creating systems that were both functional and creative. The neighbors were fascinated, asking questions and suggesting ideas. Karen contributed, offering suggestions that demonstrated her growing understanding. The man encouraged discussion, letting people share their thoughts and observations, turning the garage into a collaborative learning space. By late afternoon, the group began to thin out, but the atmosphere remained warm and positive.